Okay, so let's get started. I am Brian Gorman. I am managing editor of Change Management Review. Our editor-in-chief, Teresa Moulton, had intended to be the host today. And like all of us, hopefully, she has clients. And one of her clients pulled her into something last minute. Okay. So I'm glad you're all here. Our topic today is simplifying change management. I have had the honor and I'm grateful to have met and recorded podcasts with each of our guests. I'm going to start by asking you to just briefly introduce yourself and tell us where you're coming to us from, and then we'll move into the conversation. Ed?
Hey everyone, so my name is Ed, short for Edwina Pike. I'm based out of London in the UK, so I'm splitting the difference between Brendan and Erica here. And I run an advisory firm called Pike Squared, but I'm also the creator of something called Irrational Change.
And Erica?
I am Erica Anderson. I'm the founding partner of a company called Proteus. And we focus on what we call leader readiness. So helping leaders be ready for whatever comes, give them the skills and the mindset and the understanding to be ready. And a big part of our practice is our change practice. And as Brian knows, and I think Ed and Brendan know, my latest book, which is called Change from the Inside Out, is about how to help people through change.
Great, thank you. And Brendan?
I'm Brendan Baker. As Ed mentioned, I'm in sunny Australia, although the sun's not up yet. It is 5 a.m. here, but I am the managing director of the Valuable Change Co. And what I'm obsessed about is change leadership, helping change leaders drive more valuable change. But today's conversation is also rather pertinent because I have a secondary mission, and that is to help fight unnecessary complexity.
And one of the things that really brought to mind bringing these three people together is that they're not talking about making change management simpler just by not doing some of this stuff. They're really talking about, and I use a quote from one of the Chief Justices whose name totally escapes me now, one of the not present, but they're talking about simplicity on the other side of the complexity that we find in change management. So let's start with the question, what is driving so much complexity into change management these days? Erica?
There are so many ways, and I'm so excited to hear what Ed and Brendan have to say about this. I think the basic thing that drives complexity, two things. One is most of us don't like change and are afraid of it. And so we kind of put our heads down and we lose track of the whole. We just get into little pieces, and it's more comforting to focus on the 1,000 little pieces that are right in front of you than keep your head up, which leads to the second thing, which is where in a complex organism, the simplicity comes when you have a big enough picture to see the whole. And people lose track of the whole especially when there's big complex change. One of the change projects we're working on right now, people they go toward the tactics, they go toward the weeds, and you have to continually help them pull their eyes back up to the level of the whole change, which is where the simplicity of the organism resides.
Brendan, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly with Erica, but I also think there's another human factor in there, and that's our tendency to strive for perfection. Organizational change has been an element and around for such a long time that we keep refining the tools, we keep sharpening the saws. You can sharpen your hammer too, I guess. But the thing is, change by its nature is messy. It's hard. It's not an easy process, and we keep trying to find ways to make it easier, but that's the wrong lens. Change isn't easy, and it's not going to be easy. And so once we accept that, we can pivot the lens, we can change the lens, and we can start talking about, okay, well, simplicity doesn't mean easy, but simplicity means getting it right. And that's really been that disconnect, is this drive to try to find a way, the right tool to make it easier for us.
Jump in there, Ed.
So I'm absolutely buying to both Erica and Brendan's concepts, and I'm going to add another lens in because, again, probably like Brendan, I look at value. What's the value that's being delivered? And actually, I think that what drives a lot of the complexity we have is our external environment. I think it's shrinking organizations, and don't get me even started on the technological advances and the fact that our brains just can't cope with our modern world. And I think that happens to everyone across the change spectrum. But I do think that the shareholder need for productivity, shrinking organizations, means that we have a fundamental capacity crisis. We're all trying to do too much with not enough, and we're not very good at letting go of things. That's a natural human bias. And I think that means that we do not create change in a clean environment, to the point Brendan made. I think that we're creating change in an environment that has lots and lots of ripples. And those ripples aren't just baby ripples, they're big tidal waves. And it's hard to see our way through it.
I think that's right. And it's so fun to listen to both of you guys. And because if you take the thing that Brendan was talking about, that wanting to make things perfect, right? And then you have too many things happening at once, some of which you're going to have to let go of. And then you're like, I don't want to let go of any of them, because the way to do this change is to change every single thing and exactly the way. It's like, no, you're just going to kill yourself. That's not how it works, right?
So Ed, what drives your belief that change management can be simplified?
I don't think it's not, for me, it's actually more than just thinking that it can be simplified. I think it needs to be simplified. And the reason why I think it needs to be simplified is we carry an assumption, which is, in today's world, pretty much most executives, most people you meet in an organization are what we would call cognitively overloaded. There's too much going on. They're running on shortcuts. We don't have the time to pause and have rational thought, which means if we don't find a way of simplifying our message, and I buy in that change itself isn't simple, but a way of simplifying our message in a way that resonates, in a way that's easily relatable, we'll just be ignored.
Mm-hmm.
We won't even be listened to, because we will be tuned out because we're just too hard to listen to. So for me, the simplification is a critical need rather than something that's nice to have. I
really want to pick up on what you just said, Ed, because I really think it's right. It's that whole thing of cognitive overload. And we Proteus, we talk a lot about those simple messages. Like, can you in 2 sentences say why this change is important? Can you in 3 sentences, in less than 30 seconds, say what the future will look like when this change has been made? And if you can communicate those core message about a change, even a complex change, very simply, it helps people sort for impact. It helps people go, oh, well, these 3 things probably aren't that critical to be thinking about right now, if this is why we're doing this change. So I really agree with you. I think the simple core messaging about even the most complex change helps people get rid of some of that cognitive overload.
Brendan,
Right?
jump in here, because I know that simplification is like at the heart of not just your book and your work, but who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I swear it's not just because I'm not a complex being. It's no. So complexity does 2 things, and peaking a big time of what Ed and Erica picking up saying here is that complexity, first of all, it shifts change leaders into thinking that everything around change is too hard. Once you start layering all of the things that you need to do, it's just, look, this is just too hard. Let's just shift it all away, and I'm just going to manage this on time and budget and be done with it, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's very much to their detriment. The second element is that complexity often hides what really matters. When you manage just on time or budget or whatever the arbitrary levers that you want to pull are, you're not focusing on what Erica mentioned there, that why and that proof, and that what does the future actually look like, and that, I mean, I call that the change core. And if you're unable to focus on that and you're unable to get clear on that, then your change is going to fail. It's just not going to succeed. And so you need to be able to pull back from that, and so the question is, what fuels my belief that change can be simplified? Well, the answer there is I do it every day with my clients.
Mhm.
And so it can be done.
One thing I would add to that, though, Brendan, is, and you know, I mean, I'm sure Eric, you got the same thing as well, is that simplifying change isn't easy. It's not an easy thing to do. So you're working against your natural biases. So we're all literally working harder to make something easy. Yeah, it's like gliding along, it looks easy. And in order to simplify something, you have to know it. You have to know right deep, deep, deep down. And then you have to stop. And to Erica's point, say, if I've got 1 or 2 minutes, and I've only got 1 or 2 minutes, what is the best message I can give to this leader about what they can do differently, that they feel safe and confident in doing, that is going to make a difference to this change?
Yeah.
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 That bit is quite hard, and that bit takes work and takes effort. But the result on the other end of it is you're more likely to get your change adopted, you're more likely to get your advice heard, you're more likely that you'll raise the awareness of a leader that needs to have the awareness raised because the message resonates.
Yeah.
I think the other element of that is, I mean, you mentioned earlier around that cognitive overload, but everyone is over capacity, but if you actually make that space and that time to ask what I call the right questions, but if you're asking the right questions, it does get easier, it does get simpler. It's all about pulling back from the weeds for a moment, as Erica mentioned earlier. It's about pulling back and going, okay, well, let's just ask the right questions. And if we actually ask and answer the right questions and work through it, it's the change itself may be complex, but it doesn't mean that the way that we manage or drive or lead the change needs to be equally complex.
Yes, I really agree with that. And also that asking the right questions, it helps people thread it all together. One of the things that makes, so change is complex. A big change is complex. But one of the things that makes it seem complicated versus simple is when you don't see the connections between the different aspects of the change, right? And when people are asking the right questions, you kind of see how the hip bone's connected to the thigh bone. You see, oh, that all ladders up to this. And when people lose track of how it ladders up, then it's like if you had all the pieces of a motor just sitting unconnected on the floor, you'd think this is just a huge mess and way too complicated. You wouldn't even know that it's an engine, right? But once you put it together in the right order, then it has this beautiful structure, and it's as simple as it can be. When things are put in the right order, they're as simple as they can be, right?
And not only that, but you can see which parts of the motor don't fit.
Yes.
And you can find that the 4 screws that, actually they're from the Hyundai down the road.
Yeah, exactly.
So what I find interesting is, just to add to that one on the complexity side, is we see an awful lot, and it's a very simple trick. We see an awful lot where change is focused on a product. So version of product versus an outcome. The product being, I'm going to deliver a center of excellence. I'm going to deliver a shared service center. The outcome being the end outcome. We're going to improve customer service record. And what we see, that just simple misstep of focusing on a product, means that to see the why is often, to your point, Brendan, unclear.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, know your why. If you don't know your why, and let's be honest, nothing's going to be perfect. We often end up with the best outcome in the situation we're in. But if you know your why, you can make the course corrections. You can adjust as you go through.
And that why, I mean, all three of us have talked about it, but the thing about the why, one of the things that we found when we were writing this book about change, one of the questions I wanted to answer was how does an individual human being actually go through a change? What happens in your brain and in your heart when you actually go through change? And one of the things we found, which I am 100% sure this will not be a surprise to either one of you, is that when a change comes at people, and it just seems like overwhelming, they want to know 3 things. And the 3 things that people really predictably always want to know about a change are, what does this mean for me? What am I literally going to have to do differently as a result of this? Why is it happening? Which is what we've been talking about, because we have such a strong preference for the status quo that it's like, give me a good reason so I can hang my brain on that, And then the third thing they want to know is, what is it going to look like afterwards? What's the post-change future? And by consistently focusing, and I will bet $1 billion, you guys do this too, by consistently focusing on answering those questions for people, the white noise goes down, and all the ways in which people make it too complicated start to relax, and they go, oh, okay, I need to do this. This is why it's happening. This is what it'll look like. Oh, okay, that's not so bad. I can kind of get my head around that, right?
So I love that you're feeding off of one another in this way. So let's keep that up. You each have your own unique approach to this question of how do we simplify change management. I'd love you to just briefly talk about that and maybe even give one or two examples around some of the common change management challenges and how you approach simplifying them. So Ed, you want to kick that off?
Absolutely. So, oh gosh, what's our approach? So we look at things probably through a slightly different lens to most, and we very much look at the behavioral end of things. So we look to behavioral science, we look a bit to neuroscience and all the rest of it. We have this concept that all change comes down to what we call a moment of choice, a human choosing to do something differently. And we focus like a laser guided missile on what we call the moment of choice. And from that, we work out what are the motivations that causes someone to be influenced to do something differently. Because if you can adjust the motivations, it makes it easier. We also take a simple view that if you can work smarter, not harder, then that makes things easier too. So within the moment of choice, we would then look outside that to what we call tribes. We talk about tribes, not teams. And because tribes represents the influencers rather than the formal structure. Those tribes have leaders. So we know leadership is the number one driver of change. We subscribe to that. But then we also look to competing priorities, what we were talking about earlier, the complexity that happens outside, and also the environment, the history and culture that's there. We then sort of say one other thing in addition to that, and it's that we use our own analogy, which we call E equals MC cubed. So E is execution, your ability to execute something. M is your motivation. Well, that's the moment of choice. And then we call the 3 C's of what we call our constraining factors, which all come down to leadership and our capacity. Do I have the capacity to lead? Capability, do I have the capability to lead, to Erica's point earlier? And then conviction, do I actually have the willingness? Is this something I have conviction for? What we would say is that if you struggle with capacity and capability, you're probably going to struggle generally. But if you have conviction, then you'll find a way to build the capacity and to build the capability because you want something enough. So we look at it through that very laser guided focus. The other thing we do is we don't assume that anything that we see front on is the truth. So a great example I would use here is decision making, and it's the perennial thing we find in every organization we go to. And although it's not technically a change thing, it's a real good description of how humans think and how humans behave. And when decisions don't get made, it's not because people don't know who the decision maker is. Everybody knows who the decision maker is. But it's because they've got in the habit of using some tactics to give themselves time to think. And those 3 tactics are these. They delegate to someone else. Have you asked Auntie May? Have you asked the guy in the corner shop? He might have an opinion on this. They defer it. This isn't a good time. Maybe we can come back next week. I'm a bit busy now. Or they ask for more data. Do you have the details of the over 70s population in the Northeast? Now, all 3 of these are just tactics to buy time. So in our work smarter, not harder way, we say, actually, how can we make sure that you're ready to make a decision? How can we give you the time that you need? How can we build that into the decision-making process so you're more likely to be ready to make the decision at the point the decision needs to get made? So slightly offbeat example, but hopefully that helps prompt some thoughts. But it's about peeling it back and getting to the root cause. And then from the root cause saying, then how can I take the friction out of the system? How can I remove the sludge? How can I take the friction out? How can I make it easy for this to happen? There you go. Is that
Erica, can you share a little bit about your approach?
Yeah. So fun listening to you guys. So one, we call it something different, but I think we're probably talking about the same thing as your moment of choice. So I started to talk about this a little bit, this idea of how an individual human being goes through a specific change, right? And the first thing we call proposed change, where people start gathering this information about what does it mean for me and why is it happening and what will it look like. But then the center point, I think it's very similar in a lot of ways to what you were saying. I hope I'm understanding it. It's this mindset shift that because historically most of us throughout history, change has generally been a danger. Most of us are wired to see change as a danger and a threat. So our mindset, especially when change is imposed upon us, is generally that the change, any change, but this change specifically, is going to be difficult and costly and weird. And difficult means I don't know how to do it, and other people are going to get in the way of me doing it. And there are going to be lots of obstacles. Costly means it's going to take from me things I value, right? And that could be time and money, but it's also more likely to be invisible things like identity and relationships and power and influence and reputation, you know. So we think it's going to take those things away from us. And weird just means, oh, this is not how we do things around here. It's strange, right? So the point, what leaders in change need to get better at doing is making that mindset shift in themselves and then helping others make it from thinking this change is going to be difficult, costly, and weird to thinking that it could be easy or at least doable, rewarding, and normal, right? And so a lot of what we have this 5-step change model, and not to go through the whole model, the point is to help organizations, a lot to the point of what you were saying too, Brendan, do the technical and practical and nuts and bolts part of the change as simply and cleanly as possible, while cascading as many people as possible through that mindset shift so that they're willing to actually adopt the change as it's being made. So that's the core of our approach.
Thank you. And Brendan.
So I mentioned at the very beginning that I'm obsessed with change leadership, and that's been born out of an entire career spent changing organizations. And in all honesty, I've worn probably every hat you could wear when it comes to managing a change. PMO lead, project lead, change lead, stakeholder lead, risk lead, benefits lead, like basically everything. And I've probably got every certification and qualification over that period of time as well. And what I found is that the industry, and I think we're all a little bit guilty of it, but it gets really deep and narrow in terms of project management, really deep, really narrow. There's 150 different ways to do project management, stakeholder management, and stakeholder readiness, and benefits management. They're all deep and narrow. And I'll try not to be cynical and say deep and narrow sells courses and certificates, but honestly, what we need to be looking at is as change leaders, we need to be driving holistically. We need to be able to bridge that deep and narrow. We need to be able to drive across the top. And how do we do that without getting into that level of complexity? I mean, when that level of complexity is needed, hire in an expert, but really we need to be able to drive across that top and drive that. So earlier in this discussion, Ed mentioned ripples. And I love that because that's the exact imagery that I use when I think about this, because change occurs through ripples. And so my model is all about 3 ripples. The first is that you start with your change core. And we've already talked a bit about that, but that's very much the why are we doing this? How will we prove success? And what exactly are we doing? And you answer it in that order. Mm-hmm. And then you get clear on that. And then that ripples out into inside your change. And this is all about your change momentum. And it's funny, out of all of those deep and narrow avenues, no one's talking about how to maintain the momentum within your own team, which I have seen $100 million programs fall over because the teams lost their momentum. And yet no one talks about that. And so that's that second ripple. And then the third ripple, that's I guess that more prototypical stakeholder analysis style view, but that's all about influence. It's all about readiness. It's all about how do we actually drive this through our organization or through our client base, our customers. And it's that ripple out approach. And they're not once and done ripples. You don't do the core, then the inside, then the outside. You start with the core, but then you need to keep them continually rippling through.
Ed talked about tribes, and Brendan, I know you talk in very similar language. And as one example of simplifying change management, you have 2 questions that let you identify the leaders of those tribes, those informal structures. Are you willing to share those 2 questions with our?
I am. Yeah,
audience?
absolutely. Nothing's secret. I mean, it's all available in my book, right? No, but look, here's the interesting thing is I've got to provide a little bit of context before I deliver the questions, because otherwise they don't make a whole lot of sense. Harvard professor has written a book called Linked. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. Really interesting. It does get fairly mathematical. I guess the key takeaway from it is that all human-made networks follow the same pattern, and that pattern is hub and node, where you have a small number of connective hubs which are responsible for the vast majority of connections through the network. To help you think about this, think about the internet. How do you get to any website on the internet? Through Google, through Bing, through Amazon, through Facebook, through any of those big parties, because the internet is the epitome of that hub and node style model. What's interesting is that same pattern is at play within our organizations. And so when we're looking at driving through change, basically we want to be looking for those connective hubs, because they are the most effective people to enlist for our change network, our communities of practice, our whatever term we want to use it. But they are the most effective people, but also the most efficient people to get your message out. And so if we then go, okay, well, what makes these people connectors? I found that there's 2 things. Number one, that they are value adders. They add value to all the things that they touch, or at least the majority of it. And number 2, they're information brokers. So then it's about, okay, well, how do we find these people? And we can borrow a tool or a technique from the social sciences, snowball sampling, except we essentially reverse engineer it. We flip it and we ask 2 questions. The first question that we ask, and you ask a cohort this, if you could work on any project with any 3 people, who would you choose? And that talks to that value adder aspect. And then the second element there is, the second question is, who do you go to for information, for gossip, for updates, for all of your news, essentially? And you ask those 2 questions, and then you count the names. And the more often that a name comes up, the more likely that they are one of these connective hubs, because they are a value adder and or an information broker. And they're the people that other people are nominating. So then those are the people that you target as your internal influencer network.
Thank you. Ed, could you share with us one of the core, I don't want to use the word tricks, but techniques that you use to help simplify change management?
So the power of language, I think, is probably the one I would go for. And actually, it's recognizing the power of language, and it's learning some language tricks. And there's probably 2 or 3 that I'll share very briefly. The first one is, if you want to change the accountability or the ownership of anything, then shift the language from the project to our project or your project. That simple shift of changing the language and changing how you speak about something shifts the accountability and shifts the ownership. Problem solved. The other one, and it also works very similar, another quick bit of advice, similar sort of realm, is don't ever criticize the past. It's very easy for a project team to come in and say, well, in the past we were very bad at this, but nobody can rewrite the past. And if you can't rewrite the past, you just feel really bad. You've just been badly criticized and you've got no defense because you did your best job. So that's another language one. The self-talk of an organization is in the language they use about themselves and about other teams makes a massive difference, and it gives you massive insight into what's happening within an organization. Yeah. So language is more important than you think. And we've got about 5 or 6 of the brain hacks we use all around language. Really simple. I'm embarrassingly simple, but have a massive impact if you just adopt these little language tricks.
And same question for you, Erica.
Well, I could pick out a million things to say. We all could. I really am loving listening to you guys. I'm learning so much. And I want to go in a slightly different direction, but pick up on something you just said, Ed. You used the phrase self-talk. And I think one of the things that we found out that's an important way to help simplify for each individual change and what it's going to take to go through it is to help them recognize and manage their own self-talk about the change. Because when people are on that front end of the mindset shift and they're saying, usually an individual is saying lots of things to him or herself about the change, about how hard it is, it's going to be difficult and costly and weird, and I don't know how to do it, it's going to take so much time, and I'm going to look like an idiot. There's just this of white noise inside their head, and it makes it seem so complicated and so impossible. And if you can help people manage their self-talk, often just by asking them simple questions, well, how could you make it easier? How couldn't we make this doable? Or what, okay, yeah, it'll be costly in all these ways. How might it be rewarding? What might this change bring you? And if you can help them move their self-talk toward that more kind of accurate, hopeful way, it's like turning down the white noise, and they can see much more clearly all the things that Brendan's been talking about, the pathway through it. So I think knowing that a huge part of the complexity of change is just all the craziness that's going on in people's heads about it, what's really happening outside, right? If you can just help people manage their self-talk to a more forward-looking, simple, accurate way of seeing the change, that in itself is just dramatically helpful.
We've got a lot of questions. I've got actually 2 pages of questions that participants submitted when they registered. But before we get to that, I would really like to ask you, what have you heard from the other panelists that you're taking away to sort of think on and perhaps bring to bear in your own work? Brendan?
So it's funny, I was just reflecting on this discussion, and it's funny. It's almost like there's one thing that Ed said and one thing that Erica said, which I think actually merged together really beautifully. So Ed talked about moment of choice. And I mean, I talk similarly around, the value equation, balancing balancing pain versus reward, but very much it's that moment of choice, that point of decision. But then Erica also talked about what's the self-talk and what's the journey that people need to go on internally. And I think that we're all talking about a very similar thing there, but really I think it's about driving towards that aha moment where it's, to use Erica's language, it's, this is not going to be weird and difficult. This is going to be simple and doable and normal, right? But it's that moment of, aha. And sometimes it's asking them those questions, how could you do this? But sometimes it is just dropping a little friendly frame, something, just a new mindset or a new mind frame for them. And it's about thinking around, well, how do we actually create that? Because that's a big part of what I do with my own clients. I work with leaders to help create those aha moments, that mindset shifts. But that's a big part of, that's because I'm looking to drive change with them. And so if we're looking to drive change through our organization, it's that moment of choice and that self-talk, and it's bringing that together and creating that aha.
And Erica?
I really loved what I'm my brain is just like, but one of the things that you said, Brendan, that I really liked were the 2 things about how to choose influencers. And we think a lot about that, like how do you get the people on board that are going to have the biggest impact on the organization? And we have some, like when we're encouraging people, criteria for choosing people to be on the change team, the team that's going to plan and then drive the change. We always talk about credibility, that they should be people who have high credibility in the organization. But I love the thing that you said about information brokers, the people that you'd go to people you'd like to have on a project and people you go to for information. Those are great. I hadn't heard those before. I really like that. And Edwina, also, there's so many things that you've said that I like. I really liked what you were saying about the power of language, that is so true. And leaders often speak in ways, it's like their negative self-talk leaks out their mouth, and they speak in ways that are not supportive of the change or of people making the change. And they don't even know it because it's subtle. So to really focus on language and help leaders have language that supports the success and the simplicity of change, I think is very powerful. That was helpful.
I'm a
And-
big fan. I was going to say, I'm a big fan, Brendan, of the two questions as well for the influencers, because I have to say, I do think the power, that's why I use tribes and not teams. I think the power of influence is great. And I've not heard those two questions before. So I think it's very powerful. And I like the idea of gossip in there as well, because often we go to the influencers, or we try and bring in the influencers who are the ones who hate the change, who are going to be the hardest to convert, because we find if we convert them, then they take a big crowd with them. So absolutely love that. The other thing I also loved as well, Brendan, that you said as well, it was around this ripple effect as well, and just remembering those ripples are out there and how it just ripples on its way out. And those ripples exist. So I love that. Thank you. I found that very, very powerful as well. Erica, there's something you said earlier, and it was a little bit about this sort of complex organism. Simplicity comes when you can see the whole. And I think that's a great way of describing it. I love also, Brendan, the way you said they know the core. And again, a great way of describing that core that's needed, that sort of white, the core piece. So those both really resonated for me about that, just reminder to pull ourselves out and look at the whole. So thank you. You've got my brain thinking at the moment. I'm processing probably very much like you are as well, thinking, oh, that's interesting. So thank you.
I'm really enjoying the conversation. I want to pick up on some of the questions that have come in, both in the chat and as people registered. And a lot of the questions that came in during registration had to do with methodology. I have not heard one word about methodology. So I'm going to throw out to whoever wants to pick up the ball and run. How does what you're talking about interact with methodology?
What do you mean?
Well, we've got ADKAR and we've got bridges and we've got et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's how we think about change management most often.
I'll jump in and answer a little bit for, when we're thinking about the ripples. So as I mentioned earlier, change leadership is all about driving holistically. And there is a real risk if you just funnel in on one methodology. That said, it has its role. It has its role to play. And I mean, I guess I tend to think about methodologies as, tools in the toolkit, but essentially ways of doing things to drive through those ripples. Sure. And it can sit as an underpinning aspect. So if we're talking about, looking at our stakeholders and that third ripple aspect, then yeah, sure, ADKAR is a nice way to think about that. But similarly, when we're talking about driving inside our team and we start looking at some of the project management methodologies. But mind you, don't get me wrong, that inside funnel is in no way all about project management. It's just one aspect of it. And it's all about driving holistically. So I think, and I won't talk for the other two here, but what I'm really talking about here is pulling up a level out of methodology. And we need to be thinking about this both conceptually as well as, what's the impact and the outcome that we're actually trying to drive here? Because methodology is just the car you drive in, right? It's not the destination. And I'm sure there's a million holes in that analogy, but it's really about pulling away from that methodology. It's not the most important thing.
1000% agree. And I also, people can just jump on me for this, but I think most of the methodologies are incomplete. Most of the methodologies that exist either over-index onto the kind of nuts and bolts side of change and pretend that it's just like a big project, and that's all you got to think about, and forget those pesky human beings, or they're just about the human side, like bridges, which is incredibly useful because people don't think enough about the human side, but bridges doesn't really go at all into what do you actually have to do on a practical project management kind of level to get it done. So there are tools. I don't think any of the existing well-known methodologies are complete. And I don't think any of them integrate those two aspects, the kind of technical and the human aspect of change well enough. I think you have to be helped to bring it up to do that.
I'm going to probably have knives thrown at me as well, Erica. So we'll see where we get to. What do I think? I think that any formal methodology always risks, or framework always risks, becoming a checkbox exercise, where the people who are asked to run it don't really understand it and don't really understand the logic and the theory behind it. And I think all methodologies originally had some great logic and theory behind them. I do think the ones that are most common in our field were designed over 20 years ago. I mean, Agile was done in 2003. I think, if I remember, ProSci Agile was in 1999. It's 20 years ago. I was around 20 years ago. And in those days, we had time to think. We didn't have email. We had in-trays. We went to meetings. We thought about things. There was time for rational thought. And I do think that the world we're in today, the technological advances, the things that they enable, that ability to stop and think is missing. And I don't think that the methodologies that are often quoted or used or put out there really reflect, hence the reason why we call that stuff irrational change, because we think humans are irrational. I also do think that there is a risk that if you have a toolkit, an approach, or a framework, which is what companies are looking for, they're looking for something they can teach their people to follow on a Janet and John basis. But we spend most of our time teaching the theories, understanding why humans do what they do, understanding our biases, understanding the choices, understanding what motivates us, understanding the things that lead us signal that others don't realize. These aren't in methodologies, but they're the theory that underpins it, because we believe that good change practitioners need to have judgment. And that judgment comes from being able to see the risks around you, to be able to take multiple data points like a research scientist will, to be able to assess them, to be able to try things and test things. I'll stop there.
I really agree.
Because I could carry on for hours.
Talking. I totally agree with everything you just said, especially about the checkbox thing. And also, that most of these methodologies were created 15, 20, 25, 30 years ago. When, you guys all remember this. It used to be that doing a reorg meant you pick the organization up, you shake it around, you set it back down, and then that's it for the next couple of years, right? It's not going to happen again for a long time. You don't have to worry about it. And now we're in this situation where change is continuous and nonstop and right in the middle of when you're doing one big change, another one. So it's about, God, I love what you just said. It's about judgment. We're trying to make ourselves and our organizations and our teams change capable so that we have this capability of continually going through change. And that's very different than, can we go through this one change and check all the boxes about it? Those are two entirely different things.
Picking up on something that, unless you wanted to jump in here, Brendan, I'm sorry.
Yeah, look, I just, I really, really love that. I won't go as far to put Ed on the spot as saying, do you think the methodology, does that therefore mean methodologies are obsolete? Because, there was a time and a place and they're not anymore. But I think you're absolutely right in terms of, it is all about that judgment. And it is about that moment to pull back and have that rational thought behind it. And it's an interesting idea, this idea that, that the methodologies are useful when you have that rational judgment, when you have that rational thought behind it, and when they're part of a bigger picture.
Yeah.
And they're not the solution. That they're a method there, and we shouldn't inflate them any higher than that.
Yes.
Just 2 days ago, I had a prospect ask me to write a framework for them, and I said, that's not going to solve your problem for you. It's all about empowering the people. I do a lot of in empowering the change leaders, but also embedding change leadership to be able to respond to that everyday style change that Erica mentioned. And it's the pace of change has increased. We all know this, but it's how do we think about it, and how do we respond to it, and how do we best communicate that and conceptually draw that throughout our entire organizations.
We use a phrase, you're going to appreciate this. It's a very simple phrase. It's not the tool, it's how you use it. Yeah. It's not the tool, it's how you use it. So.
Yeah, and that really applies to what Brendan was just saying about the methodologies. I think like ADKAR is a good example. There are some good things. You can use ADKAR as a tool in some circumstances, Just like you can use a work breakdown structure as a project management tool. They're tools. They're tools that we can use. And tools always are at the understanding and judgment of the user. Any tool is like that.
I really love that picture because, you know, give me woodworking tools and not so good. Give someone else woodworking tools and they're master crafters. So my judgment tells me stay away from woodworking.
At least if you want to keep your fingers, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. A few minutes ago, Ed mentioned data points. And so we've got a couple of questions that have come in around advances in technology and artificial intelligence, and what does that all mean? Anyone jump in?
What does that all mean? That's a big question, Brian. I don't know. Where do we go with that?
Well, does that help simplify? Does that make the challenge even greater?
If you assume that, what I would say is if you assume that artificial intelligence is going to take away some of the transactional based work we do that doesn't require humans, so some of the more robotized work we do, then that's going to say that the humans you do have left in organizations are going to have judgment, are going to have to do complex thinking that machines can't do and apply judgment along the way, which means our ability as change agents to change beliefs and mindsets is going to be a more critical skill than ever before. Do I think AI will replace a change agent? I don't know. I'd like to think at some point we're all replaced by leaders with capability to do this stuff as being a natural part of their DNA. I think, Brendan, you're probably on the same page as well. I wish we were all redundant because this is just part of how businesses work. Yeah. I do think there's an interesting gentleman, I can't remember his name now, and he uses an artificial intelligence process for decision making, for consensus decision making, and they actually use technology to help with that, which is an interesting dynamic.
And it's an interesting point you pick up there. Admittedly, the studies were a little bit older, but I actually looked at some studies around decision making, comparing human decision making along with machine-based decision making. And the truth was machine-based decision making, that they evaluated on 6 different criteria. I can't remember all 6, but things like accuracy and a bunch of things. But the machine was better at 5 out of the 6. What the human was best at was speed. And which really blows my mind when you look at, you know, I'm based in Canberra, Australia, which is basically the federal government here. Is based in Canberra, and so I have a number of government clients, and it always blows my mind when decision making is insanely slow, because they're losing the entire advantage that being a human gives them when it comes to decision making. It is that speed. We have this ability that isn't yet replicated by machines. Now, I admit I'm a futurist, well, a semi-futurist here, that I actually believe in the way that AIs are going, and I think it's absolutely fascinating. And I'm happy to chat to any one of you, you know, over a beer or a cider or something one day, and we can delve into what could be. But talking about what I've seen so far, it is about the human ability to connect the dots incredibly quickly. And we have this ability to pull and quickly rationalize and eliminate information and do a bunch of things incredibly quickly because we've needed to learn how to survive. And so there are these evolutionary aspects that have given us this speed of decision making. So it's not always the most accurate decision, but it is the fastest. And that's useful. And we need to be keeping that in mind and not losing that advantage when we look at decision making, when we look at change. But then it ultimately does loop back around to something you mentioned earlier, Ed, around, well, how do we make sure that we're actually making the right decisions? What do we need before we make the decision to enable us to leverage that speed?
Yeah, and I was thinking about that too, Brendan, what Ed said before about that a lot of times decisions don't get made, not because people don't know who the decision maker is, but because they're trying to get more time to make the decision. And some of that, I think, this is kind of going down a different path, but I think you guys have probably run into this too, is a lot of times people don't make decisions because, and it's the very first thing you said, Brendan, they're worried it's not going to be perfect. And I think there's a wonderful quote from Alan Kay, who said this great thing. He said, leaders don't predict the future, they invent it. And whenever we're doing change, we always say to people, look, what we're doing right now is our best guess. We don't actually know how this is going to turn out. We haven't seen it yet. We're making our best guess, and we're talking about why, and we're talking about what it's going to look like. And then as we go into the future, we're going to have to keep reinventing. And that takes a lot of the pressure off decision making. If you're trying to make decisions about a change, a lot of times people are like, well, I don't know. I can't see the future. Right. You can't see the future. So we're going to guess. We're going to make our best guess based on all the available information. And then we're going to keep, tweaking as we go.
Sorry. I was going to say it's a really, and it's a slight detour here, but I think it's a very human trait, this fear of decision-making brought about thinking too far ahead. And it's funny how often my clients will say, oh, can you do a little bit of coaching with this up and comer I've got? And so it gets added to the work that I do. And it's amazing how often I'm chatting to them around, okay, well, the career and what's next and whatnot. And they're fearful. They're fearful because they don't know where they're going to be in 10 years time. I said, well, don't worry about 10 years time. Let's look at 2. Let's look at 6 months. Let's pull this right in and reduce the impact of your decision. Yeah. And then maybe let's actually have a look at that.
The concept, Brendan, which is very, very powerful, is when organizations can't make decisions, there's normally 2 things. One is that we say humans don't hate change, they hate being surprised. And your stakeholders hate being surprised because, to your point, we make these micro choices as you go through a change. So the product you're ending up with isn't quite the one you started out with because you've had to make some judgments. And the issue isn't the fact that it's changed. The issue is I was surprised by the change. So what we do is we have a method where we actually inform and just keep people along the way of all the micro choices that they've been made. We also break decisions down into tiny, tiny, smaller decisions. So we basically de-risk the decision because then it's more likely to be made. These are just simple tactics that anyone can use. But it just takes the friction out of the system.
I need to break in here because I think we could carry this conversation on until 5 a.m. New York time.
That was an hour. Oh yeah, no, so do I.
I would like to ask each of you to just very briefly make a closing statement and then invite our editor-in-chief, Teresa Moulton, to wrap us all up. Ed?
So I'm going to give my gift that I always say, the 3 things that I think are most important when it comes to change. Number 1, role clarity if you want to deliver an outcome. Number 2, leadership if you want to change behaviors. And number 3 is trust if you want to enable any of the above.
And Erica?
I love that. The one thing I'd love to have us take away is that we are each capable of rewiring ourselves to become change capable. We can think differently about change and be more fluent in change.
And Brendan?
My one's going to be think in terms of ripples. Get clear first and then ripple out, and don't ignore the change team and don't ignore that change momentum piece. That will be your undoing. If you do. So think in terms of ripples and drive that ripple through.
Thank you. And Terry.
Good afternoon. I just want to thank everybody for attending, and I want to thank Edwina and Erica and Brendan for their time and their expertise, and the way they interwove their answers together was very high value and appreciated. So thank you for that. And Brian, thank you for the fantastic moderation job that you've done on this session. So we'll be doing more panel discussions coming up, as well as we're having our annual conference in early November. It's called Lead Change 2022. So get ready to hear more about that. And if you have any other questions or thoughts for us at Change Management Review, don't hesitate to email me at teresa@changemanagementreview.com. So thank you all very much, and hopefully we'll see you at another event soon.